readers, welcome back to Reads with Rune B, with me, Rune B. Today we will be continuing our read of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Normally, Rob would be joining us for this read. Unfortunately, he had other business to attend to, so for chapters 4 and 5, it will be me, on my own. So, with that being said, let's get into our read. Chapter 4. Oliver, being offered another place, makes his first entry into public life. In great families, when an advantageous place cannot be obtained in either possession, reversion, remainder, or expectancy, for the young man who is growing up, it is a very general custom to send him to sea. The board, in imitation of so wise and salutatory an example, took counsel together on the expediency of shipping off Oliver Twist in some small trading vessel bound to a good unhealthy port, which suggested itself as the very best thing that could possibly be done with him. The probability being that the skipper would flog him to death in a playful mood some day after dinner, or would knock his brains out with an iron bar, both pastimes being, as pretty generally known, very favourite and common recreations among gentlemen of that class. The more manifold of the advantages of this step appeared, so they came to the conclusion that the only way of providing for Oliver effectually was to send him off to sea without delay. Mr. Bumble had been dispatched to make various preliminary inquiries, with a view of finding out some captain or other who wanted a cabin boy without any friends, and was returning to the workhouse to communicate the result of his mission, when he encountered, just at the gate, no less a person than Mr. Sowerberry, the parochial undertaker. Mr. Sowerberry was a tall, gaunt, large-jointed man, attired in a suit of threadbare black, with darned cotton stockings of the same colour, and shoes to answer. His features were not generally intended to wear a smiling aspect, but he was in general rather given to a professional jollity. His step was elastic, and his face betokened inward pleasantry. As they advanced to Mr. Bumble and shook him cordially by the hand, "I have taken the measure of 2 women that died last night, Mr. Bumble," said the undertaker. "You'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry," said the beadle, as he thrust his thumb and forefinger into a proffered snuff-box of the undertaker, which was an ingenious little model of a patent coffin. "I say you'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry," repeated Mr. Bumble, tapping the undertaker on the shoulder in a friendly manner with his cane. "You think so?" said the undertaker, in a tone which half admitted and half disputed the probability of the event. "The prices allowed by the board are very small, Mr. Bumble." "So are the coffins," replied the beadle, which is with as precisely as near to approaching a laugh as the great official ought to indulge. Mr. Sowerberry was much tickled at this, and of course as he ought to be, and laughed a good long time without cessation. "Well, well, Mr. Bumble," he said at length, "there's no denying that, since the new system of feeding has come in, the coffins are somewhat narrower and more shallow than they used to be. But we must have some profit, Mr. Bumble. Well-seasoned timber is an expensive article, sir, and the iron handles come by canal from Birmingham." "Well, well," said Mr. Bumble, "every trade has its drawbacks. A fair profit is, of course, allowable." Of course," replied the undertaker. "And if I don't get a profit upon this or that particular article, why, I make it up in the long run, you see." Just so, said Mr. Bumble. Though I must say, continued the undertaker, resuming the current of observations which the beetle had interrupted, though I must say, Mr. Bumble, that I have to contend against one very great disadvantage, which is, that all the stout people go off the quickest. The people who have been better off, and have paid rates for many years, are the first to sink when they come into the house. And let me tell you, Mr. Bumble, that 3 or 4 inches over one's calculations makes a great hole in one's profit, especially when one has a family to provide for, sir. As Mr. Sowerberry said this, with becoming indignation of an ill-used man, and Mr. Bumble felt that it rather tended to convey a reflection on the honour of parish, the latter gentleman thought it advisable to change the subject. Oliver Twist being uppermost in his mind, he made him his theme. By the by, said Mr. Bumble, you don't happen to know anybody who wants a boy, do you? A parochial apprentice, who is, at present, a dead weight, a millstone, I may say, around the parochial throat. Liberal terms, Mr. Sowerberry, liberal terms. As Mr. Bumble spoke, he raised his cane to the bill above him, and gave 3 distinct raps upon the words £5, which were imprinted thereon in Roman capitals of a gigantic size. Gadso, said the undertaker, taking Mr. Bumble by the gilt edges of his lapel official coat. That's the very thing I wanted to speak to you about. You know, dear me, what a very elegant button this is, Mr. Bumble. I've never noticed it before. Yes, it is rather pretty, said the beetle, glancing down proudly at the large brass buttons which embellished his coat. The die is the same as the parochial seal, the Good Samaritan healing the sick and bruised man. The board presented it to me on New Year's morning, Mr. Sowerberry. I put it on, I remember, for the first time, to attend the inquest on that reduced tradesman who died in a doorway at midnight. I recollect, said the undertaker. The jury brought in died from exposure to the cold and want of common necessaries of life, didn't they? Mr. Bumble nodded. And they made a special verdict, I think, said the undertaker, by adding some words to the effect that if the relieving officer had... Tosh! Foolery! Interposed the beetle. If the board attended to all the nonsense that ignorant jurymen talk, they'd have enough to do. Very true, said the undertaker. They would indeed. Juries, said Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane tightly, as was his wont when he was worked into a passion. Juries indicated vulgar, grovelling wretches. So they are, said the undertaker. They haven't more philosophy nor political economy about them than that, said the beetle, snapping his fingers contemptuously. No more than that. No more than they have, acquiesced the undertaker. I despise 'em, said the beetle, growing very red in the face. So do I, rejoined the undertaker. And only wish we'd had a jury of the independent sort in the house for a week or two, said the beetle. The rules and regulations of the board would soon bring their spirit down for 'em. Let 'em alone for that, replied the undertaker, and so saying he smiled approvingly to calm the rising wrath of the indignant parish officer. Mr. Bumble lifted off his cocked hat and took a handkerchief from the inside of the crown, wiped from his forehead the perspiration which his rage had engendered, and fixed the cocked hat on again. Turning to the undertaker in a calmer voice, "Well, what about the boy?" "Oh," replied the undertaker, "why, you know, Mr. Bumble, I pay a good deal towards the poor rates." "Hem," said Mr. Bumble. "Well?" "Well," replied the undertaker, "I was thinking that if I pay so much towards 'em, I've a right to get as much use out of 'em as I can, Mr. Bumble. And so, I'll take the boy myself." Mr. Bumble grasped the undertaker by the arm and led him into the building. Mr. Sowerberry was closeted with the board for 5 minutes, and it was arranged that Oliver should go to him that evening upon a liking, a phrase which means, in the case of the parish apprentice, that if the master finds, upon a short trial, he can get enough work out of the boy without putting too much food into him, he shall have him for a term of years to do with as he likes. When little Oliver was taken before the gentleman that evening, he was informed that he was to go that night as a general house lad to a coffin maker's, and that if he complained of his situation, or ever came back to the parish again, he would be sent to sea, there to be drowned or knocked on the head, as the case might be. He evinced so little emotion, they, by common consent, pronounced him a hardened young rascal, and ordered Mr. Bumble to remove him forthwith. Now, although it was very natural that the board, of all people in the world, should feel a great state of virtuous astonishment and horror at the smallest tokens of want of feeling on the part of anybody, they were rather out on this particular instance. The simple fact was, that Oliver, instead of possessing too little feeling, possessed rather too much, and was in a fair way of being reduced, for life, to a state of brutal stupidity and sullenness by ill usage he had received. He heard the news of his destination in perfect silence, and having had his luggage put into his hands, which was not very difficult to carry, inasmuch as it was all comprised within the limits of a brown paper parcel, about a foot square by 3 inches deep. And he pulled his cap over his eyes, and once more attaching himself to Mr. Bumble's coat cuff, was led away by that dignitary to a new scene of suffering. For some time, Mr. Bumble drew Oliver along without notice or remark. For the beetle carried his head very erect, as a beetle always should, and it being a very windy day, little Oliver was completely enshrouded by the skirts of Mr. Bumble's coat, as they blew open, and disclosed to great advantage his flapped waistcoat and drab plush knee breeches. As they drew near their destination, however, Mr. Bumble thought it expedient to look down, and see the boy was in good order for inspection by his new master, which he accordingly did, with a fit and becoming air of ungracious patronage. "Oliver," said Mr. Bumble. "Yes, sir," replied Oliver in a low, tremulous voice. "Put that cap off your eyes and hold your head up." Although Oliver did as desired at once, he passed the back of his unoccupied hand briskly across his eye, and left a tear in them when he did, so that it shone when he looked up at his conductor. As Mr. Bumble gazed sternly upon him, it rolled down his cheek. It was followed by another and another. The child made a strong effort, but it was an unsuccessful one. Withdrawing his other hand from Mr. Bumble's, he covered his face with both, and wept until tears sprung out from between his thin, bony fingers. "Well!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble, stopping short, and darting at his little charge a look of intense malignity. "Well, of all the ungratefullest and worst disposed boys I ever did see, Oliver, you are the—" "No, sir, no," sobbed Oliver, clinging to the hand which held the well-known cane. "No, sir, no. I will be good. Indeed, I will, sir. I'm a very little boy, sir, and so." "So what?" inquired Mr. Bumble in amazement. "So lonely, sir, so very lonely," cried the child. "Everybody hates me, sir. "Oh, don't, sir. Pray, please don't be cross with me." The child beat his hand upon his heart and looked up into his companion's face with tears of real agony. Mr. Bumble regarded Oliver's piteous and helpless look with some astonishment for a few seconds. And 3 or 4 times in a husky manner, after muttering something about that troublesome cough, bade Oliver dry his eyes and be a good boy, then, once more taking his hand, walked on with him in silence. The undertaker, who had just put up the shutters of his shop, was making some entries in his day-book by light of a most appropriately dismal candle when Mr. Bumble entered. "Ah," said the undertaker, looking up from the book, pausing in the middle of a word. "Is that you, Bumble?" "No one else, Mr. Sowerberry," replied the beadle. "Here, I've brought the boy." Oliver made a bow. "Oh, that's the boy, is it?" said the undertaker, raising the candle above his head to get a better view of Oliver. "Mrs. Sowerberry, will you have the goodness to come here a moment, my dear?" Mrs. Sowerberry emerged from a little room behind the shop, and presented the form of a short, thin, squeezed-up woman with a vixenish countenance. "My dear," said Mr. Sowerberry deferentially, "this is a boy from the workhouse I told you of." Oliver bowed again. "Dear me," said the undertaker's wife, "he's very small." "Why, he is rather small," replied Mr. Bumble, looking at Oliver as if it were all his fault that he were no bigger. "He is small, there is no denying it. But he'll grow, Miss Sowerberry, he'll grow." "I dare say he will," replied the lady pettishly, "on our victuals and our drink. I see no saving in parish children, not I, for they always cost more to keep than they're worth. However, men think they know best. Here, get downstairs, little bag of bones." And with this, the undertaker's wife opened a side door and pushed Oliver down a steep flight of stairs into a stone cell, damp and dark, forming the anteroom to the coal cellar, and denominated the kitchen, wherein sat a slatternly girl in shoes down at heel, with blue worsted stockings very much out of repair. "Here, Charlotte," said Miss Sowerberry, who followed Oliver down. "Give this boy some of the cold bits that were put by for Trip. He hasn't come home since this morning, so he may go without them." I dare say the boy ain't too dainty to eat 'em, are you, boy?" Oliver, whose eyes had glistened at the mention of meat, and who was trembling with eagerness to devour it, replied in the negative, and a plate full of coarse, broken victuals was set before him. "I wish some well-fed philosopher, whose meat and drink turn to gall within him, whose blood is ice, whose heart is iron, could have seen Oliver Twist clutching at the dainty viands that the dog had neglected. I wish he could have witnessed the horrible avidity with which Oliver tore the bits asunder with all the ferocity of famine. There is one thing I should like better, and that would be to see the philosopher making the same sort of meal himself, and eating with the same relish." "Well," said the undertaker's wife, when Oliver had finished his supper, which she had regarded in silent horror with fearful auguries of his future appetite, "Have you done?" There being nothing eatable within reach, Oliver replied in the affirmative. "Then come with me," said Miss Sowerberry, taking up a dim and dirty lamp, and leading the way upstairs. "Your bed's under the counter. You don't mind sleeping among the coffins, I suppose? It doesn't much matter whether you do or you don't, for you can't sleep anywhere else. Come, don't keep me here all night." Oliver lingered no longer, but meekly followed his new mistress. Chapter 5. Oliver mingles with new associates. Going to a funeral for the first time, he forms an unfavorable notion of his master's business. Oliver, being left to himself in the undertaker's shop, set the lamp down on the workman's bench, and gazed timidly about him with a feeling of awe and dread which many people a good deal older than he will be at no loss to understand. An unfinished coffin and black trestles stood in the middle of the shop. It looked so gloomy and deathlike that a cold tremble came over him every time his eyes wandered in its direction, from which he almost expected to see some frightful form slowly rear its head to drive him mad with terror. Against the wall were arranged in a regular array a long row of elm boards cut into the same shape, looking in the dim light like high-shouldered ghosts with their hands in their breeches pockets. Coffin plates, elm chips, bright-headed nails, shreds of black cloth lay scattered on the floor, and the wall behind the counter was ornamented with a lively representation of two mutes in very stiff neckcloths on duty at a large private door, with a hearse drawn by 4 black steeds approaching in the distance. The shop was close and hot. The atmosphere seemed tainted with the smell of coffins. The recess beneath the counter, in which his flock mattress was thrust, looked like a grave. Nor were these the only dismal feelings to depress Oliver. He was alone in a strange place, and we all know how chilled and desolate the best of us will sometimes feel in such a situation. The boy had no friends to care for, or to care for him. The regret of no recent separation was fresh in his mind. The absence of no loved and well-remembered face sunk heavily into his heart. But his heart was heavy, notwithstanding. And he wished, as he crept into his narrow bed, that were his coffin, and that he could be laid in a calm and lasting sleep in the churchyard ground, with tall grass waving gently above his head, the sound of the old deep bell to soothe him in his sleep. Oliver was awakened in the morning by a loud kicking outside of the shop door, which, before he could huddle on his clothes, was repeated in an angry and impetuous manner about 25 times. When he began to undo the chain, the legs desisted, and a voice began. "Open the door, will yer?" cried the voice which belonged to the legs which had kicked at the door. "I will directly, sir," replied Oliver, undoing the chain and turning the key. "I suppose you're the new boy, ain't yer?" said the voice through the keyhole. "Yes, sir," replied Oliver. "How old are you?" inquired the voice. 10, sir." "Then I'll whoop yer when I get in," said the voice. "You just see if I don't. That's all, my workus brat." And having made this obliging promise, the voice began to whistle. Oliver had too often been subjected to the process to which the very expressive monosyllable had just recorded bears reference, to entertain the smallest doubt that the owner of the voice, whoever he might be, would redeem his pledge most honorably. He drew back the bolts with a trembling hand and opened the door. For a second or two, Oliver glanced up the street and down the street, over the way, and over the way, impressed with the belief that the unknown who had addressed him through the keyhole had walked off a had walked off a few paces to warm himself. For nobody did he see but a big charity boy, sitting on a post in front of the house, eating a slice of bread and butter, which he cut into wedges the size of his mouth with a clasp knife, and then consumed them with great dexterity. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Oliver at length, seeing no other visitor made his appearance. "Did you knock?" "I kicked," replied the charity boy. "Did you want a coffin, sir?" inquired Oliver innocently. At this, the charity boy looked monstrous fierce, and said that Oliver would want one before long if he cut jokes with his superiors in that way. "Don't you know who I am, You don't know who I am, I suppose, Workus," said the charity boy in continuation, descending from on top of the post, meanwhile, with edifying gravity. "No, sir," rejoined Oliver. "I'm Mr. Noah Claypole," said the charity boy, "and you're under me. Take down the shutters, you idle young ruffian." With this, Mr. Claypole administered a kick to Oliver, and entered the shop with a dignified air, which did him great credit. It is difficult for a large-headed, small-eyed youth, of lumbering make and heavy countenance, to look dignified under any circumstance. It is more especially so when he is superadded to these personal attractions are a red nose and yellow smalls. Oliver, having taken down the heavy shutters, broke a pane of glass in his efforts to stagger away beneath the weight of the first one to the small court on the side of the house in which they were kept during the day. This was graciously assisted by Noah, who, having consoled him with the assurance that he'd catch it when he condescended to help. Mr. Sowerberry came down soon after. Shortly after, Miss Sowerberry appeared, and Oliver, having caught it in fulfilment of Noah's prediction, followed the young gentleman down the stairs to breakfast. "Come near the fire, Noah," said Charlotte. "I saved a nice little bit of bacon for you from the master's breakfast. Oliver, shut the door at Mr. Noah's back, and take them bits that I put out on the cover of the bread pan. There's your tea. Take it away to that box and drink it there. Make haste, for they want you to mind the shop. D'ye hear? D'ye hear us, Workus?" said Noah Claypole. "Lord, Noah," said Charlotte, "what a rum creature you are. Why don't you let the boy alone?" "Let him alone," said Noah. "Why, everyone lets him alone enough. What, for that matter? Neither his father nor mother will ever interfere with him ever again. All his relations have let him have his own way pretty well. Hey, Charlotte?" "Oh, you are a queer soul," said Charlotte, bursting with a hearty laugh, in which she was joined by Noah. After which they both looked scornfully at poor Oliver Twist as he sat shivering on the box in the coldest corner of the room, and ate the stale pieces which had been specially reserved for him. Noah was a charity boy, not a workhouse orphan. No chance child was he, for he could trace his genealogy all the way back to his parents, who lived hard by, his mother being a washerwoman, and his father a drunken soldier, discharged with a wooden leg, and a diurnal pension of 2 pence halfpenny, and an unstable fraction. The shop boys in the neighbourhood had long been in the habit of branding Noah in the public streets with the ignominious epithet Leathers, Charity, and the like, and Noah had borne them without reply. But now that fortune had cast in his way a nameless orphan, at whom even the meanest could point finger of scorn, he retorted on him with interest. This affords charming food for contemplation. It shows us what a beautiful thing human nature sometimes is, and how impartially the same amiable qualities are developed in the finest lords and the dirtiest charity boy. Oliver had been sojourning at the undertaker's some 3 weeks or a month. Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry, the shop having been shut up, were taking their supper in the little back parlour, when Mr. Sowerberry, after several deferential glances at his wife, said, "My dear," he was going to say more, but Miss Sowerberry was looking up with a particularly unpropitious aspect. He stopped short. "Well," said Miss Sowerberry sharply. "Nothing, my dear, nothing," said Mr. Sowerberry. "Ugh, you brute," said Miss Sowerberry. "Not at all, my dear, not at all," said Mr. Sowerberry humbly. "I thought you didn't want to hear, my dear, what I was going to say." "Oh, don't tell me what you were going to say," interposed Miss Sowerberry. "I am nobody. Don't consult me, pray. I don't want to intrude upon your secrets." As Miss Sowerberry said this, she gave a hysterical laugh which threatened violent consequences. "But, my dear," said Mr. Sowerberry, "I want to ask your advice." No, don't ask mine," replied Miss Sowerberry, in an affecting manner. "Ask somebody else's." There was another hysterical laugh, which frightened Mr. Sowerberry very much. This was very common and much approved of matrimonial course of treatment, and which is very often effective. It at once reduced Mr. Sowerberry to begging, as a special favour, to be allowed to say what Miss Sowerberry was most curious to hear, and after a short altercation of no less than 3¾ of an hour's duration, the permission was most graciously conceded. "It's only about young Twist, my dear," said Mr. Sowerberry. "A very good-looking boy, that, my dear." He need be, for he eats enough," observed the lady. "There's an expression of melancholy in his face, my dear," resumed Mr. Sowerberry, "which is very interesting. He would make a delightful mute, my dear." Miss Sowerberry looked up with an expression of considerable wonderment. Mr. Sowerberry remarked upon it, without allowing time for any observation on the good lady's part, and proceeded. "I don't mean a regular mute to attend grown-up people, my dear, but only for children's practice. It would be very new to have a mute in proportion, my dear. You may depend upon it. It would have the most superb effect." Miss Sowerberry, who had a good deal of taste in the undertaking way, was much struck by the novelty of this idea, as it would have been compromising her dignity to have said so under existing circumstances. She merely inquired, with much sharpness, why such an obvious suggestion had not presented itself to her husband's mind before. Mr. Sowerberry rightly construed this as an acquiescence of his proposition. It was speedily determined, therefore, that Oliver should at once be initiated into the mysteries of the trade. And with this view, that he should accompany his master on the very next occasion his services being required. This occasion was not long in coming. Half an hour after breakfast the next morning, Mr. Bumble entered the shop, and supporting his cane against the counter, he drew forth his large leathern pocket-book, from which he selected a small scrap of paper, which he handed over to Sowerberry. "Ah," said the undertaker, glancing at it with a lively countenance. "An order for a coffin, eh?" Coffin first, parochial funeral afterwards," replied Mr. Bumble, fastening the strap of the leathern pocket-book, which, like himself, was very corpulent. Baton, said the undertaker, looking from the scrap of paper to Mr. Bumble. Never heard that name before. Mr. Bumble shook his head as he replied, Obstinate people, Mr. Sowerberry, very obstinate. Proud, too, I'm afraid, sir. Proud, hey? Exclaimed Mr. Sowerberry with a sneer. Come, that's too much. Oh, it's sickening, replied the beadle. Antimonial, Mr. Sowerberry. So it is, acquiesced the undertaker. We only heard of the family the night before last, the beadle said, and we shouldn't have known anything about them at all. Then, only a woman who lodges in the same house made an application to the parochial committee for them to send the parochial surgeon to see the woman, as was very bad. He had gone out to dinner, but his apprentice, being a very clever lad, sent him some medicine in a blackening bottle, offhand. Ah, there's promptness, said the undertaker. Promptness indeed, replied the beadle. But what's the consequence? What's the ungrateful behaviour of these rebels, sir? Why, the husband sends word back that the medicine won't suit his wife's complaint, and so she shan't take it. Says she shan't take it, sir. Good, strong, wholesome medicine, as was given with great success to 2 Irish labourers and a coal heaver only a week before. Sent to 'em with nothing, with a blackening in the bottle. And he sends back word she shan't take it, sir. As the atrocity presented itself, and Mr. Bumble's mind in full force, he struck the counter sharply with his cane, and became flushed with indignation. Well, said the undertaker, I never did. Never did, sir, ejaculated the beadle. Nor nobody never did. But now she's dead, and we've got to bury her. That's the direction, and the sooner that's done the better. Thus saying, Mr. Bumble put on his cocked hat wrong side first, in a fever of parochial excitement, and flounced out of the shop. Why, he was so angry, Oliver, that he forgot even to ask after you, said Mr. Sowerberry, looking after the beadle as he strode down the street. Yes, sir, replied Oliver, who had carefully kept himself out of sight during the interview, and who was shaking from head to foot with a mere recollection of the sound of Mr. Bumble's voice. He needn't have taken the trouble to shrink from Mr. Bumble's glance, however, for the functionary, on whom prediction of the gentleman in the white waistcoat would have made a strong impression, thought that now the undertaker had got Oliver upon trial, was a subject better to be avoided, until such time as he should be firmly bound for 7 years, and then all the danger of his being returned upon the hands of the parish should thus be effectually and legally overcome. Well, said Mr. Sowerberry, taking up his hat, the sooner this job's done, the better. Noah, look after the shop. Oliver, put on your cap and come with me. Oliver obeyed, and followed his master on his professional mission. They walked on for some time through the most crowded and densely inhabited part of the town, and then, striking down a narrow street, more dirty and miserable than any they had yet passed through, paused to look for a house which was the object of their search. The houses on either side were high and large, but very old, and tenanted by people of the poorest classes. As their neglected appearance would have sufficiently denoted, without the concurrent testimony afforded by the squalid looks of the few men and women, with folded-up arms and bodies half-doubled, occasionally sulked along. A great many of the tenements had shop fronts, but these were fast closed, mouldering away, and only the upper rooms being inhabited. Some of the houses had become insecure from age and decay, and were prevented from falling into the street by huge beams of wood reared against the wall and firmly planted in the road. But even these crazy dens seem to have been selected as the nightly haunts of some houseless wretches. For many of the rough boards which supplied the place of door and window were wrenched from their positions to afford an aperture wide enough for the passage of a human. The kennel was stagnant and filthy. The rats, which there were many, lay putrefying in their rottenness. They were hideous with famine. There was neither knocker nor bell handle at the door where Oliver and his master stopped. So, groping his way cautiously through the dark passage, and bidding Oliver to keep close to him and not be afraid, the undertaker mounted the top of the first flight of stairs. Stumbling against a door on the landing, he rapped on it with his knuckles. It was opened by a young girl of 13 or 14. The undertaker saw at once enough of what the room contained to know this was the apartment to which he had been directed. He stepped in, and Oliver followed him. There was no fire in the room, but there was a man crouching mechanically over an empty stove. An old woman, too, had drawn a low stool to the cold hearth and was sitting beside him. There were some ragged children in another corner, and in a small recess opposite the door there lay upon the ground something covered with an old blanket. Oliver shuddered and cast his eyes toward the place and crept involuntarily closer to his master. For though it was covered up, the boy felt sure it was a corpse. The man's face was thin and very pale. His hair and beard were grizzly. His eyes were bloodshot. The old woman's face was wrinkled. Her 2 remaining teeth protruded over her lip, and her eyes were bright and piercing. Oliver was afraid to look at either her or the man. They seemed so like the rats he had seen outside. No one shall go near her," said the man, starting up fiercely as the undertaker approached the recess. "Keep back, damn you, keep back, if you've a life to lose." "Nonsense, my good man," said the undertaker, who was pretty well used to the misery in all its shapes. "Nonsense, I tell you," said the man, clenching his hands and stamping furiously at the floor. "I tell you, I won't have her put in the ground. She couldn't rest there. The worms will worry her, not eat her. She is so worn away." The undertaker offered no reply to this raving, but produced a tape from his pocket and knelt down for a moment by the side of the body. "Ah," said the man, bursting into tears and sinking on to his knees at the feet of the dead woman. "Kneel down, kneel down, kneel all around her, every one of you, and mark my words. I say she was starved to death. I never knew how bad she was until the fever came upon her, and then her bones were staring through her skin. There was neither fire nor candle. She died in the dark. In the dark! She couldn't even see her children's faces, though we heard her gasping out their names. I begged for her in the streets. They sent me to prison. And when I came back she was dying, and all the blood in my heart has dried up, for they starved her to death. I swear before the God that saw it, they starved her." He twined his hands in his hair, and with a loud scream, rolled groveling upon the floor, his eyes fixed, and foam gushing from his lips. The terrified children cried bitterly, but the old woman, who had hitherto remained as quiet as if she had been wholly deaf to all that had passed, menaced them into silence. Having unloosed the cravat of the man, who still remained extended on the ground, she tottered toward the undertaker. "She was my daughter," said the old woman, nodding her head in the direction of the corpse and speaking with an idiotic leer, more ghastly than ever in the presence of death in such a place. Lord, well, it is strange that I who gave birth to her and was a woman then, should be alive and merry now, while she is lying so cold and stiff. Lord, Lord, think of it. It's as good as a play, as good as a play. As the wretched creature mumbled and cackled in her hideous merriment, the undertaker turned to go. Stop, stop, said the old woman in a loud whisper. Will she be buried tomorrow, or the next day, or tonight? I laid her out. I must walk. You know, send me a large cloak, a good warm one, for it is bitter cold. And we should have cake and wine too before we go. Never mind, send some bread, only a loaf of bread and a cup of water. Shall we have some bread, dear? She said eagerly, catching at the undertaker's coat, as he once more moved towards the door. Yes, yes, said the undertaker. Of course, anything and everything. He disengaged himself away from the old woman's grasp, and drawing Oliver after him, he hurried away. The next day, the family, meanwhile, having been relieved with a half-quartern of loaf and a piece of cheese left within by Mr. Bumble himself, Oliver and his master returned to the miserable abode, where Mr. Bumble, already having arrived, accompanied by 4 men from the workhouse who were to act as bearers, an old black cloak had been thrown over the rags of the old woman and the man, and the bare coffin, having been screwed down, was hoisted onto the shoulders of the bearers and carried out into the street. Now, you must put your best leg foremost, old lady, whispered Mr. Sowerberry in the old woman's ear, for we are rather late, and it won't do to keep the clergyman waiting. Move on, men, quick as you like. And thus directed, the bearers trotted under their light burden, and the 2 mourners kept as near to them as they could. Mr. Bumble and Mr. Sowerberry walked at a good smart pace in the front, and Oliver, whose legs were not as long as his master's, ran by his side. There was not so great a necessity for hurry as Mr. Sowerberry had anticipated, however, for when they had reached the obscure corner of the churchyard in which the nettles grew and the parish graves were made, the clergyman had not yet arrived. The clerk, who was sitting in the vestry room by the fire, seemed to think it by no means improbable that it might be an hour or so before he came, and so they put the bier on the brink of the grave, and the 2 mourners waited patiently in the damp clay, with the cold rain drizzling down, while ragged boys, whom the spectacle had attracted into the churchyard, played a noisy game of hide-and-seek among the tombstones, or varied their amusements by jumping back and forth over the coffin. Mr. Sowerberry and Bumble, being personal friends of the clerk, sat by the fire with him and read the paper. At length, after a lapse of some more than an hour, Mr. Bumble and Sowerberry and the clerk were seen running towards the grave. Immediately afterwards, the clergyman appeared, putting on his surplice. He came along. Mr. Bumble then thrashed a boy or 2 to keep up appearances, and the reverend gentleman, having read as much of the burial service as could be compressed into 4 minutes, gave his surplice to the clerk, and walked away again. Now, Bill, said Sowerberry to the gravedigger, fill her up. It was no difficult task, for the grave was so full that the uppermost coffin was within a few feet of the surface. The gravedigger shovelled in the earth, stamped it down loosely with his feet, shouldered his spade, and walked off, followed by the boys, who murmured very loud complaints at the fun being over too soon. Come, my good fellow, said Mr. Bumble, tapping the man on the back. They want to shut up the yard. The man, who had never once moved since he had taken his station by the graveside, started, raised his head, stared at the person who had addressed him, walked forward a few paces, and fell down in a swoon. The crazy old woman was too much occupied in bewailing the loss of her cloak, which the undertaker had taken off, to pay him any attention. So they threw a can of cold water over him, And when he came to, saw him safely out of the churchyard, locked the gate, and departed on their different ways. Well, Oliver, said Sowerberry as they walked home. How do you like it? Pretty well, thank you, sir, replied Oliver, with considerable hesitation. Not very much, sir. You'll get used to it in time, Oliver, said Sowerberry. Nothing when you are used to it, my boy. Oliver wondered in his own mind whether it had taken a very long time to get Mr. Sowerberry used to it. But he thought it better not to ask the question, and walked back to the shop, thinking over all he had seen and heard. And that is the end of our story for now. Until next time, stay safe, be excellent, and keep reading. Bye for now, readers.